Okay, welcome everybody to the 5 unsolved questions in retail site selection 2026. I was just talking with the panel before. These guys that are on this panel, I respect a lot, and I have learned a lot about from retail site selection. And retail site selection is going through an interesting world in 2026. There's a few trends that are emerging, and I'm hearing 5 questions that I really just haven't heard before in the as much volume as I am hearing today about how to do site selection 2026. And so on this panel, I want to have our panelists introduce themselves, but we're going to be going through each of those 5 questions. So let's get into it, guys. The first person that is on my screen, I'm gonna have you do your bio here, is Dale. So we'll kick it off with you, Dale. Can you tell us a little bit about your background, the company you work for?
I can tell you a little bit. My name's Dale Goss. I work with Raising Cane's Restaurants. I'm head of real estate with Raising Cane's. I have been in restaurant development and real estate for about 40 some odd years now. So all the way from Pizza Hut building Delco's a long time ago with Pizza Hut through casual dining at Brinker International and now working with Raising Cane's. And very happy to be here. Looking forward to a great discussion and lots of great questions.
Right on, Andrew.
Hey everybody. So I'm Andrew Nealon, founder and CEO of Four Wall. We're a brick and mortar advisory firm, helping brands get from what I call projects to program. Background in finance, real estate, and retail. Really starting at Bonobos, then into Walmart's ecosystem, running their shared services platform, then Interior Define, and most recently at a med spa platform. So I've kind of seen the gamut of D2C and medtail.
Right on. Yeah, 2 very different perspectives already so far. And then Ryan.
Yeah. Hey, nice to see everyone. I'm Ryan Reedus, head of real estate for Hopdoddy. In my second year doing that. And before that, I was with CBRE on the consulting side, leading the UHG and Optum account from a strategy and market planning standpoint. And then spent 8 years at Buxton doing site selection consulting for restaurant, retail, private equity. Led that group over there for a handful of years. And then before that was with Richards Group in Dallas, doing brand consulting. Kind of always been in the restaurant space. So even at Richards Group, I was on the Chick-fil-A account, leading that in my 20s. And I've always been in the restaurant space. My family's been in the business for a long time. So sort of came out of school and wanted to get into hospitality. And so my foray into real estate has sort of been through the consulting path. I'm not a traditional deal guy. I'm more site selection analytics consulting. So yeah, really excited to be a part of this group and honored to be here.
Right on. Okay. So there's a fair amount of people on the live stream. And why would you do something live if you couldn't ask questions? So you can phone in to the radio show and ask any question you want. So just put it in the comments. I've noticed there's like a 15-second delay. So I might pick up your question and ask it as we get into it. But let me just go through our 5 questions so you know what we're going through. One is how to deal with a constrained market in real estate, just since we have such low vacancy right now. What do you do when you have rising costs all around? What about the evolving mindset of the US consumer, where we are seeing sentiment as an all-time low, and then you see consumer spending is actually up? So how do you deal with those signals? What do you do when the data lies or disagrees? Like, what if your visitation shows great numbers, but the demographics doesn't fit? Everybody deals with some of these contradictions in site selection. And then lastly, how are you using AI really? And I would love to be convinced with this because I just really haven't seen amazing use cases in retail site selection, unlike advertising, which I feel like it really is shaking up right now. So those are the 5 questions. Panelists, please hold me to it because I tend to really noodle on one question and not let it go. But let's jump into the first one. Okay, so retail in 2026, total paradox. You have vacancy at around 4 to 5%, and usually Class A retail is more around 4%. At the same time, you had 8,100 store closures in 2025. That's up 12%. And we're not building a whole lot of new space. So we got 10 million feet of new space in 2025. That's 63% below 2019. And my first question for you guys is, how are you feeling the effects of this constrained market right now? Like what texture is it showing up in your work? And if it's okay, I think I'd like to run this by Ryan first, because Ryan, I think you guys, you'll do second gen properties. So are you feeling any of the effects on a constrained market? And you guys are also in Texas too, so that plays a role.
So we have 50 units right now, 48, about 6 in pipeline. So our CAGR growth is about 10 to 15% per year. And yeah, we're pretty heavily Texas focused, a handful of markets outside of Texas. But yeah, I think for us, it's a crowded space. I think for us, we go into some second gen spaces very opportunistically. We have sort of our metrics that work. We're doing some new development stuff as well. And we just try to be nimble. We try to advance and have a plan for where we want to go. And for us, that's our strategy is Texas Plus. So that's optimizing all of our major Texas markets and then opportunistically growing into some secondary and tertiary smaller Texas markets. And then optimizing Phoenix and Nashville right now is our 3 to 5 year growth strategy. But we just try to be really aggressive. We know where we want to be in advance. So then when, the brokerage teams bring us deals, we can jump on them pretty quickly. So we try to run as much of the analytics in a day or two when we get presented an opportunity, and
Mm.
we're pretty nimble being a small company. We can make decisions fairly quickly and, issue an LOI within 2 or 3 days. So that helps us be competitive. We know exactly what our prototype is, what box we want, what markets we want to be in. And so that gives us, I think, a big advantage. But yeah, we do see a lot of competition, in our category. And for me, it's sort of, high level retail is not dead, just irrelevant retail is dead. So, we're competing against other concepts like us that have similar vibes, similar hospitality profile, and then all the other site criteria, needs to line up. But we just try to be quick.
When you say you know where you want to show up, is that at the market level, or do you actually know, like you have a specific geographic region in mind for Nashville or any of these other areas? And a follow-up question for that, you say you have the analytics in place that you can get an LOI out within a few days. What are like the key analytics are you looking at? Is it your predictive model? Is it your foot traffic numbers? So those two questions there.
Yeah, so we partnered with Calibrate a couple of years ago, and we have our site selection with them right now. Our model, it is a predictive multivariate regression model right now, and we refresh it every year, and we run that white space analysis every year as well. So, that's probably more germane to my job than some other parts. But yeah, we look at a couple different things. We look at massive mobile data as a piece of their model. Just foot traffic. We look at the proliferation of the right types of people. So differentiating between core customers or core guests as sort of a heightened focus for us. And then, co-tenancy and competition, we were talking about in our last session, sort of the interplay of the two and how challenging it is to sort of detangle. And we look at that as sort of a ratio, right, of supply and demand. So, if that ratio looks good and the competition's set that we're looking at, we want to sort of strike that chord between the restaurant row effect and then that point of oversaturation. And that's where we look at. So in the burger space, we're a fast casual burger and be sort of chef driven but accessible. And so we look at other share of stomach competitors like Velvet Taco, Torchy's. We look at other non-burger players as competitors, but also co-tenants. So we're striking a balance between the right number of people in the right space, and then everything else is sort of like trade area demographics. We look at household income, big share counts of people within our drive time trade areas. We vary that by urbanicity. So our drive time trade area is a little bit smaller in urban markets. It's a little bit larger in suburban rural markets. And so it's really a tailored approach. And it's always that intersection of art and science, right? We look at the data, on the score sheet. The first 2/3 of my job is at the desk, and then that vibe. Just you can't underestimate the importance of the vibe and all the site characteristics, visibility, signage, ingress, egress, super important. So, we drill down like funneled approach, right? We look at market planning at the top. We look at the strategic markets that we want to be in, and then we go down funnel a bit. We talk about the specific sub markets. So, like Nashville, for example, we like Green Hills, we like East Nashville, we like Germantown. We have a site in Memphis that does really well. So we're sort of figuring out how to fit in around our existing site in Hillsborough Village, and then where else we want to go in Nashville. So strategically and just sort of paying attention to that market, we know where we want to be, and then down funnel, it's right opportunity presents itself, and then we get to evaluate it with boots on the ground and the desk work pretty quickly.
Dale, you guys, as I understand it, are doing a lot of new builds. So how does this affect you, or does it at all?
Yeah, so it does. And a lot of the themes that Ryan was just talking about are very similar to what we do. We have strategy in place for basically every market, every DMA across the country that is developed. We are also a Calibrate client. And so developed using sales forecasting models. We use a number of other things. We use retail node visits out of Placer. We're looking actually, we have a concept we call unique trade area. So we look at our trade areas a little bit differently. We don't look at radius or drive time. We've actually developed a look based on where our customers live. And then we look at where those trade areas begin to overlap with existing restaurants. And we try to boil that down to understand what trade area, what level of residential population each restaurant has. We run correlations as we've put together strategy to understand how many residents, what kind of population it takes to support our restaurants. That may vary depending upon competition, depending upon region, things like that. We've got strategy in place. We know exactly where we're going to go. We have sales expectations for each one of those trade areas, and we can get very, very with our brokers and with our real estate managers to make sure we're going to the right trade areas. We are having to manufacture, is the way we look at it, a lot of sites because there's not a bunch of new development coming, not a bunch of pads that are available. The vast majority of the deals that we have submitted over the last probably year or so to our real estate committee involve scraping something. Whether we've had a lot of casual diners that we have scraped. One of the nice things about our average unit volumes, we can look at sites that probably a lot of other QSR restaurants can't look at. And, it actually makes sense for us. A lot of it is really good real estate too. So pretty much not every one of the sites that we look at or every site that we submit, but a big chunk of them involve scraping something. Like I said, whether it's a restaurant, we've scraped office buildings, we've scraped just about everything in order to be able to manufacture sites for us. The other part for us, we're active on both coasts, where you tend not to see a ton of, especially in the Northeast, not seeing a ton of new developments. Even more important for us in those cases to identify the trade areas, and we use all the analytics, all of the data that we have to identify trade areas. And then, very similar to what Ryan was talking about too, we're turning our brokers and real estate managers loose to find the right sites in those trade areas. But the vast majority of the time, we're having to take somebody out.
So because you guys have different average unit volumes, you can essentially afford to totally level something and build something new.
We can.
Are you senses that you're not probably dealing with the competition to the same extent because there's less people are willing to do that?
Yeah, we see a lot of the similar players, as we're looking for real estate. There are a handful of QSR concepts that drive volumes high enough that they can play in that game. But we're typically, there's a handful of us. I mean, Chick-fil-A obviously, is one of those. In and Out, if they happen to be in the market, would be another one. We're typically in competition with banks, folks like that, but
Okay.
not typically competing with other QSRs to the extent that, some people might expect.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. What role does speed play for you? Because I'm wondering if you have a longer time horizon to make decisions versus Ryan.
Yeah, so we are a much larger version of what Ryan was talking about. So we're founder owned and led. And so we are a private company and have the ability to make decisions quickly if we want to or if we need to. So that does give us, I think, an opportunity to move quickly in a lot of cases. The other thing, because we're not public, we're not owned by private equity, we don't have that relentless pressure to produce numbers. And so the flip side of that, we can be very patient too when we need to. So if we've identified a trade area that we want to get into, and the right real estate is not coming available, we're not going to compromise just to get a deal done. We can be very, very patient when we need to, because again, that huge pressure, quarterly earnings calls, all those kinds of things, we don't deal with. And that is part of the beauty of being founder owned and led. And it, on the development side, it gives us a lot more flexibility than you might see other places that are dealing with different circumstances.
That's awesome. I just finished up listening to a David Sinra episode on the founder Todd Graves. The beginning of story where he's putting restaurants on credit cards is pretty wild at like a 20% interest rate, but that is a level of conviction that is admirable.
Yep. The good news is we have moved beyond, putting restaurants on a pizza card. Yeah, completely different world. And, you look at our growth over the past, especially 3 or 4 years, the position we're in, the pipeline that we have, we're in a great position. But, the ability, like I said, in kind of a constrained marketplace, our ability to manufacture sites is I think one of the critical pieces of our
Mm,
success, for the last couple of years and going forward.
yep. Andrew, I imagine, have such a different perspective on this because my expectation is that based on the clients that you've done site selection for, th- they're usually Class A retail space. So now the clients that you are coaching, what are they going through and how's the environment working for them and what's important?
Yeah, I think a lot of similar principles is what Dale and Ryan described. And as they were talking, I was kind of distilling in my head how I would kind of package that same context. And I think it comes down to really four things, because right now, a lot of that Class A real estate, there's basically a wait list for everywhere most of the kinds of brands I work with want to go. And so, if nothing else, they're getting impatient and frustrated with the fact that they have growth plans that are very challenging to execute on. And to help navigate that, I kind of think about four major things that need to happen at the brand level. And again, a lot of this is going to echo what Dale and Ryan said. But the first and I think most important thing is getting really, really clear about what does success actually mean, what unlocks a deal, and what is the objective criteria for that deal to even be worth bringing to a committee. Because I think on one hand, I've worked with brands that are pre-revenue, and I've worked with brands that are as big as 250 million in revenue, and I've worked within the Walmart governance ecosystem. And there's this one common thread, which is you need to have a very clear set of governance of when does a deal pass through each individual milestone or stage gate, and what actually constitutes an approval, and who do you need to approve it. On one hand, Walmart had literally, I think, 5 or 6 different committees I had to go in front of to approve a deal. And we very quickly set up a set of guardrails to say, all right, these are the threshold criteria. If it falls within this, we don't need to go through half of these approvals anymore because we just can't get anything done. And I think especially now, and I think to Ryan's point, being nimble is really, really important because it's a landlord market. And why would they wait, 3 months for a decision when they've got somebody already who's ready to go? So that's kind of piece two, is being nimble. Also being opportunistic. I think a lot of brands, when they try to put a little bit too much science to this, they say, well, I can't pick the number 6 location in my target list until I get number 3, 4, and 5. And I think we're now at a point with limited supply such that you got to get comfortable with some level of that. Obviously, you need to be smart about it, but it's already hard enough back when real estate was in more abundant supply to get a perfect sequencing, and getting comfortable with how far down that list are you really willing and able to go, and how do you change the underwriting for that. So not just being nimble in reacting to deals, but nimble in your decision making framework. And then the last thing I would say is also just getting really good with pattern recognition. As both Ryan and Dale pointed out, there's basically an infinite number of variables that can influence a decision. But how do you really get crisp about which variables actually are correlated with the success of that underwriting or of that forecast, and just get rid of the stuff that doesn't? I've been in committees where 7 out of 10 data points will say that this is a good bet and 3 don't. But those 3 have never consistently predicted anything. So why are we even talking about it? And so I think a lot of that work is where I kind of push a lot of brands in the beginning to say, before we even get to what I would call real estate operations, let's first figure out the decision-making framework, the data points that matter, and the construct and the governance that we will be executing in, because all of that will then dictate the framework you put in place to then actually go execute.
Man, I love those steps, and I love the way you expedited the price process in Walmart, which feels really important, especially now. How do you develop that level of pattern recognition, Andrew? Is it what I'm wondering is when you have a store that did well, okay, then now you have a pattern, but how do you isolate which one of the 10 variables that you mentioned actually was the cause of the store doing well? Or is it in vibes? Is it like you just sense it?
It is a little bit of vibes over time, or at least that's how it manifests. But what I would say is, like, what I've always done when I was in house was I would just build these monster databases and refresh them every single month to see what the new data has shown me. And what you'll find sometimes, and I'll use interior design as an example. What we found was that the most predictive variable of the new store success, or one of the most predictive, was just how many sales reps we had in the store. It was that simple. But as iOS changes were happening and it started getting challenging to drive leads at the level that it was before, it became less about how many salespeople you had and more about how efficient your marketing was. And so it's important to refresh your forecasting models, your data models, I would say at minimum quarterly, but do a monster overhaul every year to reset the whole framework. But keeping a pulse on it, minimum quarterly. Again, I usually do monthly just to stay super on top of it and include data points that, maybe don't show any real predictive power yet, but that gut intuition and that vibe tells you like there's probably something here somewhere. I just don't know how it's going to show its head, but at some point it will. And that's something that I see time and time again, where there's a variable that nobody really thinks is that important until it is. And if you had been tracking it from the beginning, you can see very clearly, wait a second, there's there's something weird happening here. And I think developing that level of pattern recognition and seeing the whole gamut of variables and just keeping a pulse on it, somebody on the team or a consultant managing that to basically say, hey, there's some signal happening here. Not sure what it is, but we should start paying attention.
Lyden, we've done very similar kind of thing. We built a huge, Excel spreadsheet database, and we, as a part of our strategy last year, correlated just about everything we could think of to sales, just trying to look for patterns, to Andrew's point, looking for patterns, throwing everything in that we could think of, some of the stuff that we, thought historically everybody thought was important, stuff that might not be so important. We even had some fun. We ended up with a little project we called Mythbusters. One that everybody continues to look at, and it's kind of old school real estate, is average daily traffic. And so we correlated average daily traffic to our sales, and it was one of the worst correlations that we looked at. And so, yeah, how about that? There are a lot of things that are much more correlated to our sales than average daily traffic. A whole bunch of people driving by didn't necessarily mean a high sales volume, but we do the same thing. We load it up, and I know we're going to talk about it later, but that's one of the things that we've used AI for too. So far, is actually digging into that database that we have outside of the calibrating model we were talking about. So outside of our sales forecasting model, but it gives us, our internal team, an opportunity to dig into all those variables. Again, look for whatever we can find that will help us either support or ask some questions about what we might be seeing from our sales forecasting model.
That's amazing. Just a little extra technical question here is, are your team doing that all raw in Python, or are they using an analytics software like Ultrix to do that?
So I guess you said raw. We're pretty raw.
Okay.
We've really, using Excel for a long, long time. What we're using now is chat, and we're running a ton of stuff through chat now and try to leverage that. We may look at some other, AI too, but for the longest time, it was just us. There are three of us, as you know, that do analytics here. And it was the three of us just basically manually trying to find patterns, trying to recognize things in an Excel spreadsheet.
That's awesome. Okay. This is a question for the
Which
full group. Go ahead, Andrew.
Oh, sorry. I just wanted to add one more thing to that, which is that I think one of the things that I've noticed among a lot of real estate teams is, there's the ones that I've found to be most successfully finding those correlations are the ones where there's just somebody who's super, super curious and just cranking through the data all the time. It doesn't even need to be, it helps if they're a statistician, but they don't need to be. And you can find some really funky things that, we're all talking about correlations, right? But one of the data points that I found was just looking at a histogram, a scatter plot, where the correlation of the data itself was pretty meaningless, but the distribution was a bell curve. And what I was looking at, I think, was looking at average household incomes by zip code versus how much e-com revenue we were doing. Because we had always, as a company, said we like more affluence, we like more income, but it's a bell curve. What I found. And basic correlations there would tell you there's nothing here, but there very much is. It was just the wrong metric. And so I think as companies are putting together these monster databases, it takes just a level of curiosity that is surprisingly hard to find at a lot of companies, particularly in our kind of microcosm among retailers as brick and mortar.
Andrew, we talk about that all the time. I mean, just be curious, ask questions. If it works, fantastic. If not, we probably learn something anyway. But we'll have a lot of theories.
Mhm.
We'll dive in, start playing with the data. And sometimes, it may lead us in a direction we never thought about. But it is just about being curious.
Neat.
We like to think of ourselves as scientists, and we'll develop a theory, a thesis, test it out. If it works, like you said, great. If not, we just keep going and we keep asking questions.
I love this question from Andy Miller in the comments here. Do you have an example of a variable that became a surprise key performance indicator? To the extent that you guys are able to talk about that, have you ever had a surprise one like that? Andrew, you kind of mentioned one there.
Yeah, I would say it wasn't necessarily an indicator of a store's performance, but was an indicator of who our customer was, and more importantly, who they weren't. I think a lot of data points that people look at in this field of site selection is with this idea that more is always better. More income, higher income is better. And that's just not always the case. And I would argue rarely is the case. It kind of
Yeah.
tops off and drops down over time. There is that kind of perfect band. And as I've built a lot of forecasting models over the years, I've started switching to just regular regression analysis to actually identifying and scoring based on where are they within the band. That's what I'm looking for, not more is better.
Yeah. Great framework. Okay. Well, let's go to costs. I'm gonna read out some interesting statistics. So build out costs are up to $155 nationally. That's up 5% the previous year. That's per square foot. You have national asking rent is $25.29 per square foot. And I think that's since 2022, that's up 22%. And this is really interesting. The Class A rent gaps are widening. So between Class A and Class B, there's a 42% difference in rent. So has the rising costs, and this could become from elevated food prices, tariffs, imported goods, cautious lenders, has the rising costs affected the sites that you guys are currently considering? This could be for anybody.
So for us, we're always looking at costs, and yes, I mean there's always pressure, especially as you look at kind of 22 to 23 was a big jump as we kind of came out of the pandemic. We saw a lot of inflation, especially on the construction side. 22, 23 started to flatten out, looking 24, 25, but it's still there. The real estate side, I think, like we talked about earlier, just looking at a constrained market and looking at prices, real estate is getting, significantly more expensive, especially looking at A sites. And so we haven't necessarily changed our strategy, but as we look at the economics of deal, evaluating, the trade areas, making sure that we understand sales forecasting, understand risk, understand whatever downside protection that we have, paying that up, looking at sales forecast and, costs. The thing that we are doing now is we're taking multiple looks along the way. Uh, so, obviously as we're getting the real estate managers are identifying something, we go through a preliminary approval process. It gets approved to, get it ready for real estate committee, goes to real estate committee, but then, that's kind of our first big financial decision. We also have a couple of other check-ins that we take very seriously when the contract comes in to be signed. And then we typically get an inspection period anywhere between 90 and 100 days on our deals. As we get toward inspection period end, we've been through all the due diligence. We know more about the site, should have a better cost forecast. We've got another check-in that we take very seriously too. So, as we're going through that entire process, looking at both, like I said, sales forecasting, understanding risk, looking at costs, we're very, very diligent about making the decision each step. And excuse me, we reserve the right to change our mind.
Mm.
So just because something has been real estate committee approved doesn't mean, it is just going to continue to move if either the cost, the cost profile, risk, something has changed. We're gonna go back and take another look at it. And so we're working with it. We're looking at site size is one of the things that we're looking at too, just to try to make sure that we're controlling real estate costs, making sure that we understand site size, kind of where the ideal is for us in order to be able to accommodate whatever sales forecasting we're looking at. So we're getting real serious about site size. And then we're also
Mm.
getting real serious working with our designers and our construction team, making sure that, we're as efficient as we can be as we look at the site improvement costs and building costs for us to build a restaurant.
And when you're looking at site size to get the Goldilocks size, is it really just looking at it's just so there's so many variables to go to? Is it looking at your sales per square foot? Is that what you're looking at, or anything else more in depth?
Yeah, well, it's looking at sales. It's understanding sales expectation. Size of the property. Typically, we're building freestanding restaurants with dual lane drive-throughs. Looking at that, looking at parks, looking at the size of the restaurant that we can put on it as far as number of seats. We're doing more work, again, an AI plug. We're doing more work looking at channel sales to understand, dine in, or drive through, mobile to go, trying to make sure that, again, we're kind of optimized around that as we begin to understand those channels a little bit better and forecasting those channels a little bit better. It is trying to optimize around all those things. And just, with the economics and understanding the economics of each deal, kind of first and foremost to make sure that, again, it's a deal that we believe is going to add value to the company.
Ryan, you and I were really jamming in our podcast a few weeks ago around when you're work for an analytics company like I do, it's all about, okay, what's the revenues? That's what you're picturing. What's a potential market? But the reality is you have to deal with costs on the other side, and people like me often forget that. Are you experiencing in any part of your process where the rising costs are affecting how you think about your decisions?
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of a weird, sort of yes and sort of no. I mean, yes, rising costs are always something that we pay attention to. We're looking to value engineer in sort of smart ways where we can, acknowledging that our space is super important and our build out costs are not cheap, to create the type of restaurants that we feel, lend a good vibe, for our guests. So there's not a ton of ways that we can really cut costs. We try to, Mitch Liggett, our head of design and construction, has been doing this for 25 years. So he's really smart at finding little ways to save money in the build out costs. But in our forecast, we're typically taking into account year one, year two, and year three sales top line. We're plugging in, our base square footage. We're building in TIA. We're building in build out costs. And then we're looking at, certain cash on cash and sleeve it metrics. And we'll take the calibrate forecast as a piece of that. And then we'll have different rationale for why we think it'll do better or worse, comps, market level things. For us, it's really more so about value engineering to keep a control of cost as best we can and making sure that we're going into trade areas where that, top line sales figure will be the highest. We're doing a lot of box resizing, to Dale's point, like most of our restaurants were in that 35 to 4,000 square foot range. And we just built a restaurant that's 2,800 square feet. And it's our next to smallest box besides River Oaks. And it's number 3 in the chain right now.
Wow.
And in the burger space, we know that very little of our business took place off premise. We're sort of a dine in experiential brand. And after COVID, we had restaurants in Austin that were doing 30, 40, some approaching 50% of off premise sales, which was sort of crazy for us. So, one of them was, on William Canyon, we had a mobile order pickup window in a restaurant we call Little Dottie. It's a full hop Dottie expression now, but we sort of took that and said, the market is telling us something. So we re-engineered some of our products, some of our packaging. Catering has become a bigger thing for us, as I'm sure it has for Dale. And so we're doing a lot more off premise. We're testing mobile order pickup windows. We're sizing the box down a bit. Hop Dottie is a 15-year-old brand. And so we want to create that beehive effect where the vibe inside the restaurant is still full. We don't want guests, waiting around the block, like they used to in South Congress, but we do want the restaurants to be busy and feel like that lends itself to a good experience. So, we're sizing the box down a little bit. We're doing mobile order and walk up pickup windows, which helps us control costs a little bit. And then for us, it's really more about risk mitigation. And we look at risk sort of from a site specific standpoint, from a center standpoint, how likely is the project to succeed? And then from a trade area standpoint. So, we quantify risk on a sliding bar chart for all three of those aforementioned groups and then give rationale for why we think it's, high or low. And we use that to help, qualify our forecast. So, at the end of the day, I'm responsible for providing our top line forecast, and that's A piece of that comes from Calibrate, and a piece of it comes from the risk assessment, and a piece of it comes from the more intangibles like the site characteristics, which is not going to be picked up in our forecast at 50 restaurants. Yeah, it's really piecing together all that to try to make sure that our cash and sleep at the hurdles are met for new sites.
Andrew, when I've been doing my analysis on brands as it relates to cost, I've primarily been looking at it from a casual sit down restaurant, a quick serve restaurant, and then like large big box retailers. Like that's been my focus. And so I have been seeing this theme of slimming down and awareness of cost being really beneficial. But how does that play out in apparel? Because I in apparel and basically anything other than the industries I just mentioned, is it the same conversation or does it take on a different texture?
Yeah, there are definitely some similarities. I would say because of how tight the market is, it's a little bit tough to say, well, we're only going to go after small spaces of this range. But a lot of it comes down to just again, back to governance. What level of risk are you willing to underwrite on a per deal basis, and how are you willing to blend that portfolio over the course of a year to say, I'm willing to take a risk here, but that means that everything else needs to be a little bit more conservative. What I've typically seen is, there's an optimal footprint size. I think a lot of brands who are historically trying to go for larger spaces are now more comfortable with the smaller ones where they can find it. But it really also just comes down to the overall delivery condition and unit economics of the space because it's just so hard to have optionality right now, particularly
Yeah.
as a specialty retailer. And so a lot of the kind of cost framework, I would say, there's kind of two layers of it. The first layer is in underwriting to say what I always describe as like, what's the need to believe? If this is our typical OpEx model, this is our tipping staffing structure, and this is our typical build out, and here's the deal, then what you're really solving for is the top line forecast. And before even getting to the actual forecast itself, I always like to start with, well, what do you need to believe the year one is for the rest of this to even make sense? And is that number even worth building a forecast for, or is it just so outrageously easy or difficult that we don't even need to go through the depths of that exercise? But then going through line by line, particularly post opening, to say, okay, we started with revenue. What's driving that? Is it foot traffic? Is it conversion? Is it cart size? That's the formula. But then going through every single line item to say, well, where can we find opportunity on how much we're discounting here versus other channels? And oftentimes in my world, stores have much better margins because they don't have to be as discount heavy with that customer base versus e-com. Same thing with returns and going literally like I will literally export a store's P&L from their ERP and just go line by line to say, why is that number that? Why is that number that? And where can we find opportunity? Because especially for retailers that are at scale, maybe the much bigger picture items have been addressed. But if you kind of add up what I call like the paper cuts of the P&L, that's probably a lot at scale.
Mm,
And if you can just kind of aggregate what those paper cuts are and solve those, then that may be just as valuable to the P&L as value engineering the entire build out.
mm.
So there's a couple different ways to look at it, but I would say for these smaller brands that are already very, very budget conscious, a lot of it really comes in the operating model itself, generally because again, in my world, a lot of these retailers are relatively new as a company to reading, analyzing, and improving on a store P&L versus a broader corporate or marketing P&L.
Okay, let me play that back to you to see if I got it. So you'll actually go and look at the retailer's P&L of existing stores. We're not talking about anything pro forma. And then you will go line by line and say, is there opportunity here to improve that? And you'll find some spaces, you're calling them paper cuts. And then that one helps your current store. But Andrew, you're using that as your next site. You're looking at it. Is there anything that I can optimize for this next site when we build something new? Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, yes, because there's, not only does helping the existing fleet obviously help with broader cash flow, but it also helps give you conviction that you can underwrite a healthier store P&L than what your current P&Ls look like. And I think that's always a big back and forth that I've historically had with various teams to say, well, why are we underwriting a pro forma that looks like this when the average store P&L actually looks like that? And there's often a disconnect where finance and real estate are underwriting deals that the operations team, they don't even know how they're supposed to kind of maintain that pro forma
Mhm.
and execute on it. And that's a huge disconnect that I see at brands, small or large. And so, solving the more you can fix and solve for your existing stores, the more conviction you can give to underwriting a riskier pro forma that is actually believable.
Man, that's awesome. That's really cool. I mean, and especially for your particular client profile, that is massive for them. Okay, let's jump to what do you do when the data lies? So I'm just going to read a
Sure.
quote from a recent ICSC article. Retailers today have more access to more location data than ever before. You got demographic analytics, foot traffic patterns, consumer spending, mobile tracking, competitive intelligence, predictive modeling. The list goes on. Sophisticated platforms can tell you how many people walked into your storefront last Tuesday, their household income, and where else they shop, and what they bought for lunch. Yet, making confident site selection decisions has never felt harder. Welcome to today's retail confidence crisis. That might be a little bit overblown, but there's 100% some truth going on here. Is what do you guys do when you have all this data and you have data disagree? So my first question is, where does the data most likely disagree for you? Where you get conflicting stories? And then when that happens, what do you do? How do you work that out as a team?
So for us, most likely disagreement these days is sales forecasting. So looking at our calibrate model and then a lot of the stuff that we've been able to produce ourselves. And so that's typically where we're going to see some level of friction. And what we do then is we'll start to run it through multiple evaluations after that. So if we get a disagreement, and I mentioned unique trade area UTA for us, we're typically taking a look at that. What we've seen, coming out of that, we'll take a look, like you said, at regionality. We've actually developed our own sales forecasting model using chat, this spreadsheet that I was talking about earlier. So we'll compare the two of those, and it will typically lead us, to a few more questions, but it'll typically lead us to a place we can make a decision. And we'll look, like I said, we'll look at the two sales forecasting models now. We'll look at unique trade area. Uh, One of the things that we lean on heavily now inside of unique trade area ranges is segmentation, because we will see differences in sales as we look within our unique trade area ranges based on segmentation. So we'll go in, we'll take a look at the segmentations. Once we see kind of that top line, if we see those two forecasts diverge, we'll start drilling down and take a look at, like I said, trade area size, trade area segmentation. We'll look at competition. We'll start drilling down on a number of different variables to make a decision. But typically our first indication is where those two sales forecasts start to diverge.
Okay, and the sales forecast number one's calibrate. Sales
Yep.
forecast number two is we've got this big database
Yep.
that we put into ChatGPT. You're saying chat, you mean ChatGPT, yeah?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Okay. And then, and I'm just curious, the ChatGPT model, how do you see it behave in relation to your standard predictive model? Does it go higher? Does it go lower? How does it do on your current sites?
Yeah. So we've tested it against everything. It's actually very accurate. I mean, it's very accurate. It's a great, kind of a gut check for us as we're continue to work with Calibrate. So we're looking at both of them. Both of them have areas where they tend to be more accurate that we've identified. We've been able to test it against. It's one of the great things. We have an 850 restaurant, data set that we can use to build models and also test. And so
Yes.
which is, I mean, it's a wonderful thing. And so we'll test it against our existing portfolio. We've also tested it against recent openings. So we'll look at both models against, 24, 25 openings that have hit steady state where, we're confident we can understand, kind of where those things are going to land. And so we know where, like I said, we know where both of them tend to be accurate or more accurate. So we can start to, narrow it down at that point in time. And then, like I said, we'll run it through a series of kind of other checks based on variables that we know tend to correlate fairly well with our sales.
Right on. Yeah. And I love using segmentation within the trade area as a way to lean you one way or another. And I would be a bad CEO if I didn't really plug that.
Yeah, I mean, it has turned out, as we started working with the unique trade area, like I said, we saw a real strong correlation between our sales and the unique trade area population. We started to carve those into unique trade area ranges. started to look inside those ranges. And inside those ranges, we're, again, being curious, Andrew, to your point, just keeping asking questions. We looked inside those ranges. We controlled for the UTA range, started looking for other things that might drive sales inside those. And segmentation was one of the big drivers. It's not, it's more incremental movements as opposed to big movements when we look at the ranges. But segmentation was one of the big pieces. Like I said, we're starting to look at competition more in the chicken finger space. The Southeast tends to be incredibly competitive. And so we've now broken everything out, looking at it by region to understand that. But as we go through it, if the data disagrees, and we use data analytics, we use everything to identify trade areas or to understand trade areas. We really don't use data for site selection.
Hmm.
So all of the data that we use is at trade area level, understanding, demand and, potential demand for the product. And then site selection for us is a human activity.
Yes. Boy, that is an interesting. I wish I could go a little bit further on that. We don't have
We
enough
can.
time, but that is. Andrew, tell me how this plays out for you. So, where do you find
Yeah.
data disagree, and then how do you deal with that?
Yeah, I think a lot of it, to Dale's point, is it's really the underlying independent variables that create your demand forecast. When I do a forecast, I typically my kind of original career background was in finance, and a very common methodology that was used to value companies is it's just called like the football field, where you have 3 or 4 different ways to value a company, and you look at those as kind of ranges visually on a graph, and you kind of see like what micro range does each of those ranges encompass, because that is the probable outcome based on all these different ranges. And oftentimes, to Dale's point, like one method may give you a completely wacky looking range versus the others. Or someone in the room might just say, I just don't believe that data for whatever reason. And what I often kind of think about then is, okay, well, let's say this crazy outlier is the reality. What must I believe for that to be true? Like, what do I need to believe for this to actually be the outlier? And I recently heard a new phrase for this in a slightly different context, but it's called a pre-mortem, which is like, if we agree that this is going to fail, what in this data would we look at and say, that is the indicator of why this was wrong, that, or, if we agree that this is a failure. And I would say, candidly, 9 out of 10 times, if someone in the room or a certain method points to some crazy outlier high end of the range, they're probably wrong. It could happen 1 out of those 10 times that high end of the outlier hits for some reason. And then when you dig into the data in a postmortem, you realize, oh, it's because, this other data point that we didn't fully weight or properly weight. Or it's, I think the hardest thing about store forecasting is that there's an infinite number of variables that can dictate a store's success, including, and I think this one's the most underweighted, is how good of a GM do you have? I've seen stores where GM leaves for whatever reason, the store goes without a GM for just 2 months, and the store tanks 20%. And then you bring a good GM in and it goes right back up, if not even higher. And it's like, how do you weight that in a store forecasting model? And the answer is you can't. So I think when the data disagrees, it's probably because there's some other variable in there that you're not fully aware of, or you're not properly weighting, or just missing entirely. Like I've never seen a store forecasting model that somehow takes into account the quality of the GM. I don't even do that because I don't even know how you would weight that.
Mm-hmm.
But there's so many different things. And I think instead of kind of figuring out, well, who's right or what's right, the more important thing is to say, well, what must be true for this to be right or wrong? And, if we were to do a pre-mortem, what would we say in retrospect? Yeah, that would have been obvious.
That's great. There's a question I think it's really good in the chat that I'd love to hear you guys tackle. So we got a CEO of a restaurant chain with about 50 locations, which, Ryan, that's somewhere around Hopdoddy, if I'm not mistaken there. I guess the general question is to what level can we expect a predictive model to give us accurate results at that number of locations? So I get, Ryan, another way of saying this is like, how do you view your predictive model where Dale has 850 locations and you don't have that much? Like, how should he think about that?
Yeah, I mean, with site selection consulting being my background, I've seen a wide variety of different types of models. One example that comes to mind is O'Reilly Auto Parts, with 3,500 locations at the time, and service less important for that brick and mortar retail. So there's so many variables, but we would typically forecast in O'Reilly Auto Parts within about 10%. Which is super aggressive. If you can do that over several years track record, that gives you a ton of confidence. To Andrew's point, like they streamlined the process without giving too much of their secret sauce away. Where, if our forecast was within a certain range, it would skip to their C-suite, for approval, and they were approving so many deals so quickly that they needed and had good confidence in that model. In the restaurant space, we talk a lot about ops and the degree to which a GM or a good hospitality or kitchen manager, our ops leadership team can affect a store. And so we've seen that. I mean, exactly the same way, where we have a top forecasting store, we have a GM leave and sales plummet, or we have a struggling store and we bring in, a seasoned vet GM and sales immediately goes up 20%. So it's very obvious in the data, to see that change when you make a management change like that. And so we know empirically that it has a lot of weight in a forecast. You never approve a site thinking you're going to bring in a B or a C management team, right? So it's harder to prove that out in the data. So we always lead with our best foot forward there, try to, but the reality is you're dealing with, different teams, you're dealing with humans always. So we struggle with, quantifying that. And so that's challenging. From a site selection standpoint, like how much do we use the model? Our model with Calibrate is within about 20 points. So we look at R squared, we look at MAPE, we look at all this traditional model accuracy metrics, and it's a seat at the table for us. It is not the silver bullet. And we're not always in that space. I always positioned it very appropriately to all of my clients that you should not be making site selection decisions based off a 2 or 3 page score sheet. So when Dale was talking about how they use analytics or calibrate in their instances, as well as us, to establish trade areas and sort of broad market planning from the desk, we use it the exact same way. All of our site selection decisions are made after several site visits. CEO, COO, and I will go out there with the brokers, and so we put eyes on every site before we sign a deal, and we reevaluate deals along the way. We'll go through a 4 or 6 month process where we're doing several turns of the lease with legal, and we have a side LOI, and we are looking at the competitive and the co-tenant mix that may be changing in a new center or in a second gen space. And so we're constantly evaluating that until we sign the lease. But we rely on a model as an important seat at the table. I would say that it is far from like the only thing we use from a go or no go decision.
Okay. We're going to do a lightning round here. We got a little bit from Dale on this one, but we're going to go Andrew, Ryan, and Dale. How are you guys using AI really? What has been your best use case, Andrew?
I would say just building things that I always wish I could have had either from another software or from brokers. So, here's one really simple example I do frequently. Whenever I get a tour book from brokers and it's, 50 pages long, I dump it into Claude, ask it to build me an interactive web app, and then plot a walking route so I could go walk it. And with some basic charting to show rent versus square foot and color coded and all of that stuff that I would historically, when I was in house, do manually on my own in Excel. And now just kind of automate to basically take work product from other people and put it into the format I want to see it in specifically.
Right. Yeah, that's awesome. Making an actual app with it. Ryan, how about you? How are you using it?
So our CEO is challenging us at the department head level to leverage AI in new and innovative ways. I would say in real estate, we're using it more for portfolio management, lease expiration dates. That's the layup use of AI. We're not really leveraging AI even close to where I think we should be a year or two down the line in terms of, facilitating some of the revenue forecasting or throwing raw data sets, into an algorithm. I think that's an opportunity that we've yet to fully drain. So we will be focusing on that over the next 3 to 6 months. But yeah, the layup for us is portfolio management.
Nice. And Dale, I think about this cauldron of data that you make, and you're over there moving the cauldron. Tell me your top use cases for AI.
Yeah, and I'll try to hit the top use cases, but we're having a blast with it. We have developed a huge data set, like you said. And I have to give a shout out to Brendan Colby and Alec Russo, who are really the analytics team here. They've done an incredible job with it. And we've looked, I mean, we've tested, Andrew, you mentioned a couple of times about being curious. We see AI as really enabling that curiosity to a great extent too, or giving us more, more capacity to be curious. But we're looking at everything. I mean, we like I said, we developed an in-house forecasting model. Like I said, we've looked at channel sales to try to see if we can get better at forecasting and understanding channel sales. We've looked at competitors' performance, in a trade area, how that influences us. We've looked at cross shopping. We've run cross shopping through it. I mean, you name it, we've played with it. And I think we're still even, it's kind of just getting started. I think personally, I think the biggest opportunity in the real estate world is in contracts and in legal. And we're gonna start heading down that route too, because again, on our side, we've got 850 leases that are hanging out there, and have all the language that we've agreed to, that if we can get loaded up and understand, what our language looks like, fallback positions, all those kinds of things. I think there's an incredible opportunity on the legal side to make that entire process just a lot more efficient.
Yeah, right on. That's why I found the large language models to be the best at is handling lots of text because that is their
Yep,
native environment, and then doing a
exactly.
meta-analysis across all of it, just you
Yep.
can't accomplish as a human.
Yeah.
Right on. Hey guys, this is awesome. And this is also the first time I've got legitimate use cases for AI and retail site selection. And that makes me really happy. I think we check in 1-2 years from now, there's going to be a lot more. So thank you
Yeah.
everyone who's been joining us on the stream. Dale, Andrew, Ryan, this has been awesome. I love talking with you guys individually. When I get to talk with all three, it's multiplicative. So thank you guys so much.
And thank you.
Yeah, we enjoyed it.
Thanks for having us.